I'm excited to introduce you to three economists who have used the theory and concepts that I've covered in previous videos to study tropical deforestation in Brazil. Clarissa Gandor is head of policy evaluation at the think tank Climate Policy Initiative in Rio de Janeiro. Katrina Mullen is an associate professor of economics at the University of Montana, and Erin Sills is the Conger Professor of Economics and department head of the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. These three economists will explain the causes of tropical deforestation in Brazil, outline how and why deforestation has declined so rapidly after 2004, and why this trend was reversed. My first question for you is, why is the current rate of deforestation a problem?
I guess we should start by just giving you a sense of the dimension of just how big a problem it is. And we've recently just had release of the official estimate for the deforestation rate for 2021, and it's the highest rate we've seen for the past 15 years, right? So Brazil is essentially destroying a very valuable asset. The Brazilian Amazon, it plays a key role in the conservation of biodiversity, in ensuring the livelihoods of local populations. It's critical for production in both the agricultural and energy sectors, not only inside the Amazon, but in all of Brazil, largely because of its impact on water resources. It's also being able to be a key player in the production of commodities and in environmental conservation. Actually, Brazil could use the conservation of the Amazon as a huge competitive advantage for its products in international markets. And in addition to all of that, deforestation in the Amazon is actually Brazil's main source of greenhouse gas emissions. So protecting the forest is key to mitigating the adverse effects of climate change.
This rapid deforestation is going on often in areas that have no clear ownership and no designation or no plan for land use. In other cases, it's going on even in protected areas. So I think the real cost of this is that it is occurring without any consideration of the trade-offs between the negative environmental consequences, the negative environmental externalities of deforestation, and the potential benefits of deforestation, which are to create agricultural land use. And because it's occurring so rapidly and in such an unplanned manner, I don't think that Brazil is getting the best out of its resources. They're effectively burning valuable forest resources without any certainty that they're getting much benefit from that.
So if we think about, right where the deforestation is happening, then that leads to soil erosion, which reduces agricultural productivity. At a regional level, then some of my collaborators have done a lot of important research to show that removing forest can lead to longer dry seasons, more severe dry seasons at the regional level. And then when we think globally, deforestation contributes in really important ways to climate change, which affects all of us. And deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon involves a loss of a really kind of unique source of biodiversity as well.
Tell me more about why this is happening, and more specifically, what are the causes and sources of tropical deforestation in Brazil specifically?
In an immediate sense, then deforestation happens because there's something of value other than the forest. So it's converted to agricultural land, or the land is cleared for timber. And so that's because, there's some other way that people want to use the resource. But the kind of underlying cause of all of that is really externalities. So when people are making choices, whether it's the individual farmer choosing to clear land, or whether it's people in the US choosing whether to consume beef produced on land from Brazil, when people are making these choices, they're taking account of their costs and benefits, but they're not taking account of all these external environmental costs.
Clearly, the main driver of deforestation is the demand for agricultural products that are produced on the land that is cleared of forest. The largest areas of deforestation where it occurs the most rapidly in the largest patches are for commodity production for international markets. So it's to produce products like beef and soy, sometimes oil palm, for international markets. And then also producing for national and local markets as well. But the demand is for agricultural products. That's what leads people to deforest. That is facilitated, and the rate and where it happens depends on the whole policy and institutional context. So things like land tenure and enforcement and changes in those are what are allowing it to happen more rapidly now.
Brazil experienced more than a decade of declining deforestation after 2004, maybe plus or minus a decade. What does your research suggest contributed to this decline in deforestation?
My own research is a part of quite a robust body of empirical evidence today that shows that public policy played a key role in this deforestation slowdown, right? So in the early 2000s, Brazil was the country that cleared most tropical forests, both in absolute and relative terms. In 2004, deforestation rates in the Amazon peaked at massive 27,000 square kilometers per year. And at that moment, the Brazilian federal government enacted a policy action plan. And within a decade, deforestation rates had plummeted by more than 80%.
I think it's interesting to go back to the origins of this in 2004. So why there was such a big shift at the federal level in Brazil from the previous policy, which for many decades had been that the federal government promoted settlement of the Amazon, expansion of agricultural settlements, and more agricultural production in the Amazon. But of course, that raised all sorts of concerns about the negative environmental impacts, loss of what we call global public goods, so carbon emissions, loss of biodiversity. And Brazil was constantly hearing about this. So both the federal government, whenever they would go negotiate with another government, and the main companies in southern Brazil, which is where really most of Brazil's economy and political power sits, is in southern Brazil, outside of the Amazon. So whenever they would go talk to their partners or seek to make a sale overseas, this niggling question of deforestation in the Amazon would always come up. And I think what happened around 2004, especially as there was heightened attention to climate change, was that the political and economic power base in southern Brazil just got fed up with this constant problem of deforestation in the Amazon, and decided that they would actually actively try to do something about it and move towards slowing down deforestation and a more rational system of land use. Once you had the whole power of the federal government behind it, that led to a series of policies and initiatives and a shift in even how local and state government responded, because the federal government could put out incentives for them and tell them that they needed to get on board, and they would have to respond because they needed resources from the federal government.
What the evidence shows is that this policy action plan was critical. It really made a really big contribution to this deforestation slowdown. So this plan, it entailed several different policy efforts, right? Within this context of an integrated strategy for combating deforestation. It was quite innovative. It was innovative in content because it proposed novel policy instruments, but it was also really innovative in format because this was the first time that combating deforestation wasn't just a responsibility of the Brazilian Ministry of the Environment, but actually responsibility that was shared across different ministries and different spheres of government, right? And so the evidence has, the literature has already evaluated several of these different policy instruments. And my own work has looked at some of the key novel policy efforts within the framework of this policy action plan. And the critical contribution here to reducing deforestation rates was the strengthening of monitoring and law enforcement. Now, the reason for that is that the vast majority of clearings in the Amazon, they constitute an illegal practice. It's either illegal because it's happening within privately owned areas, for example, where deforestation could be legal, but this activity doesn't comply with environmental regulations, right, for clearing within these private lands. Or it might be illegal because it's happening, for example, in the public lands I mentioned in the land regarding land grabbing, and we shouldn't be seeing deforestation in these territories at all. But basically, the estimates points that more than 90% of the area that's cleared is actually illegal. So if we're talking about an illegal practice, that means that there's room here for a potentially inhibitory effect of monitoring and law enforcement, right? And so Brazil knew this when it launched that policy action plan. And so strengthening law enforcement was actually one of its priorities from the very beginning. And so Brazil launched a pioneering satellite-based monitoring system that detected the loss of tropical forest in near real time throughout the full extent of the Brazilian Amazon. So what the system did is that it basically, when it detected the loss of forest, it issued an alert, a georeferenced alert, so it marks the exact location where that forest loss happened. And then that alert gets forwarded to law enforcement authorities, which would then use that information to target their law enforcement efforts. This was really important because it essentially, it was a substantial increase in the capacity of environmental law enforcement to provide a timely law enforcement response to this illegal activity, right? And so what the evidence shows is that this group of monitoring law enforcement efforts, that they were highly effective in protecting the Amazon. They contributed to that slowdown. They avoided the loss, a significant amount of forest over time. And it's interesting to highlight that they've been shown to have been quite cost effective. So the evidence suggests that they didn't have a negative impact on agricultural production in the Amazon. And some estimates regarding policy costs and the benefits from protecting the forest, it suggests that the policy was actually quite cheap in many ways. So the benefits far outweigh the costs of protecting the forest. And there's even evidence that there was a policy spillover, that efforts that were targeted at combating deforestation in the Amazon contributed to forest regrowth in the area, right? Now, monitoring law enforcement, absolutely critical to protecting the forest, but they weren't the only thing that Brazil implemented during the scope of this policy action plan. And so in my own research, I've also explored the contribution of other policy efforts, right? And there are perhaps three other areas that are worth highlighting. So there was the targeting of critical areas, and by critical here, I mean areas that were concentrating deforestation. And this was shown to also have contributed to have reduced deforestation in these targeted areas. Brazil also introduced novel policy regarding the use of financial instruments to combat deforestation. So rural credit is a key policy for supporting agricultural production in the Amazon. And as of 2008, access to rural credit in the Amazon became conditioned upon proof of compliance with environmental regulation. And this, again, contributed to a reduction in deforestation, which also suggests that this credit was in part being used to cut down the forests, right? And then there was a third innovation of the policy of the action plan in the use of protected territories. Now, protected territories have long been used in Brazil as a means of protecting the forest, right? But within the scope of this policy action plan, Brazil started using the strategic siting of protection. So in addition to environmental criteria and to biological criteria, they also started using the actual risk of deforestation as a criteria for allocating protection throughout the territory. So these protected territories, they were meant to serve as essentially a barrier to advancing deforestation. Now, my research has shown that these territories, they were effective in protecting the forest locally. So forests that are under protection do in fact see less deforestation. But it's also interesting to see that we see some evidence of there being, that these territories, they serve a little bit like a shield. So although deforestation that's advancing doesn't really get into the protected territory, in some ways it deflects into other areas because we don't see a strong reduction in the aggregate level of deforestation associated with these protected territories. So in many ways, like taking all of this together, what this suggests is that policy is crucial to protect the Amazon, but it also points, in many ways, highlights the importance of thinking and designing, thinking about policy and designing policy within this a framework of coordinated efforts and complementary efforts, so that you can, in many ways, you can protect the forest, but ensure you won't see any spillovers for areas that are perhaps not quite as protected. And so I think it's important to really think about this in quite an integrated context.
So far, what we've been talking about then is the time period of when it was that policies were really successful in reducing deforestation. But that lasted at most a decade, since 2014, or maybe a little bit earlier. Deforestation in Brazil has now been on the rise. We know there's lots of reasons for why that's happening, but do you think you could draw any lessons from that time period of when deforestation was on the decline that we could apply, say, into this time period now that deforestation is back on the rise?
Absolutely. You're right in saying that deforestation started on an upward trend in about 2014. And it's actually gotten much worse over the past 3 years. So we've seen a 75% increase in the deforestation rate, using the recently released figure for 2021 as compared to 2018. And it's basically, we just discussed that monitoring and law enforcement were critical for the deforestation slowdown. What we're seeing now is significant weakening of environmental control in the Amazon, right? And so those two things are definitely, they're walking hand in hand, right? So monitoring and law enforcement, they were the cornerstone, right, for fighting Amazon with deforestation. Within that context, again, recall that we're talking about an illegal activity, right? And the reason why it's so critical to have a strong framework for environmental control is that the effectiveness of law enforcement essentially hinges on law enforcement's capacity to provide a timely response and to impose binding penalties, right? So the reason for that is that in many ways, the mechanisms for law enforcement's impact is that it must make the expected costs of engaging in that illegal activity exceed the expected benefits, right? And for that, you need a really strong law enforcement response. So why was the satellite monitoring system critical? Because it allowed the Brazilian Environmental Law Enforcement Authority to quickly see what was happening and where it was happening. Recall that the system, it operated in near real time, emitting those alerts for forest loss, right? This allowed law enforcement personnel to reach deforestation and these environmental offenders essentially while they were still operating. This increases their capacity, law enforcement's capacity to hold offenders accountable, which is important for a response. But it also increases law enforcement's capacity to impose a binding penalty. Because when these offenders, they're caught, they're fined, they're typically fined, right? But fines might take a while to be paid, you go into this long legal process. But what law enforcement could also do when they quickly reach deforestation activity is that they can impose a higher financial cost, because they can apprehend material that has been illegally produced. They can seize and destroy machinery, for example, right? So if law enforcement can destroy a tractor, then you're imposing a high financial burden on these environmental offenders, right? And within the context of the strengthening of environmental law enforcement that happened within the policy action plan, in addition to the satellite monitoring system, Brazil also implemented important changes to its legislation that brought greater stability and greater a stronger legal basis for implementing this law enforcement response. So why does all of that matter for now? Because what we've seen over the past decade, and more markedly so over the past 3 years, is a weakening of this framework for environmental control. So this includes quite severe budget cuts for environmental control. It includes changes to environmental governance. It includes the fact that today many decisions are being made by political appointees rather than by people who have a technical understanding of deforestation and environmental law enforcement in the Amazon, right? And in addition to all of that, Brazil is currently living a moment where there's an important aspect of signaling, right? Authorities, they have signaled tolerance and in many cases even support for these illegal activities in the Amazon. And so in many ways, this creates an incentive for more deforestation because it really lowers the cost of engaging in illegal deforestation. And so even if you look at some trajectories for the number of environmental fines that are linked with deforestation in the Amazon, the number of embargoes, what we see is that within this period of rising deforestation, we see the steady drop in the number of these proxies for environmental control, right? These numbers, they're not the whole story, but they're an important part of the story, right? And so we're talking about the highest deforestation rates in 15 years and the lowest levels of environmental sanctions of the past 15 years as well. And so at the moment, what Brazil must definitely do is strengthen its framework for environmental control, environmental monitoring, and environmental law enforcement, particularly its law enforcement response, because our monitoring system, it's not only still in operation, but it has actually improved significantly from when it was first implemented.
In my view, one of the key reasons why deforestation has started to increase is because of a lack of political will to actually enforce conservation policies. So many of the forest conservation regulations are still in place, and there are new ones even since that kind of 2004 to 2014 period. At the same time, all of the real-time satellite monitoring, that's also still in place. It's actually improved in terms of the size of patches that can be identified. So it's got better over time. So we still have all those pieces that were available in the post-2004 period. It's just about how the government wants to use them. And so I think what we can take from that early period is that if there isn't kind of a will within the federal government to actually monitor and enforce policies against deforestation, then we need to think about, well, where else can that pressure come from? And so we did see examples of these private sector supply chain initiatives that they didn't have as large an effect post-2004 as some of the government policies, but they did reduce deforestation. So I think there's scope for, thinking about, can they be expanded or strengthened? But the other piece is that we have so much information, not just within Brazil, but globally available information on where deforestation is occurring and when deforestation is occurring, that actually there's potential for collaboration between people outside Brazil, whether that is purchasers of commodities that are produced in Brazil, or whether that's NGOs, to collaborate with those within Brazil who do have a desire to reduce deforestation, either individual municipalities or individual states that more strongly recognize the benefits of reducing deforestation, or indigenous groups who appreciate the benefits of reducing deforestation. So there are groups within Brazil who are working to try and protect forests, and there's plenty of people outside of Brazil who also have a strong interest in trying to protect forests. And so with the information that's available, then there is scope for action and collaboration between those groups, even if there's less action from the federal government.
How do you think we move forward? How can we take lessons from this time period where there was a large decline in deforestation and use those lessons to devise some solutions for reducing deforestation in the future?
Well, I think let's take three courses of action here for strengthening protection of the Amazon. The first one is undoubtedly strengthening the fight against deforestation. In many ways, Brazil must recommit to fighting deforestation because it has committed to it before, and now we've lost that. And the political environment is it's key here, right? To recommitting, right? And for that, we must eliminate impunity that's associated with the illegal activity, right? So back to the idea of comparing the costs and benefits of engaging in the illegal deforestation. And for that, we need to strengthen the law enforcement environment. Again, technology is not a limitation today, right? This political environment is. And in many ways, I think that what's key here is that we've learned that law enforcement works and it can work, but we've also learned that our current framework for for environmental control has remained highly exposed to political control. Mm-hmm. And so Brazil must think about ways of mitigating this exposure, right? Ensuring that fighting deforestation is something that is based on technical grounds, right? And not only on political grounds, because essentially we're talking about a benefit that's shared across the society, right? And over a long period of time. And at the moment, we have these niche groups, these people with very short-term interests that are essentially capturing this and using this for their own benefit, right? Strengthening the fight against deforestation, we also know from the evidence that it works to target critical areas. And we have information on this because when we look, deforestation is highly spatially concentrated. So we have that over the past 5 years, half of the area that was deforested happened in only 24 municipalities. The forest extends over more than 500 municipalities in the Amazon. Some of these municipalities are huge, right? But still, these 24 municipalities that concentrate deforestation, they account for about 20% of Amazon territory. So they do concentrate a disproportionate share of forest clearing. So these areas must be targeted. Public forests that are being illegally occupied, they must also be targeted because they account for a large share of deforestation. So that's in many ways, I think, what Brazil must do and must do urgently to reduce deforestation. I also feel that protecting the forest, we must go beyond just fighting deforestation, right? And there are two main paths here to follow. So today, although we have largely focused on deforestation from a policy perspective, the forest degradation is also an important part of what's happening in the Amazon, right? So degradation is the partial loss of forests. This is typically associated in the Amazon with selective logging, with fires, and with what we call a border effect. So when you cut down the forest, you essentially expose the area of remaining forest to some elements that it wasn't exposed to before. And although it's a little bit trickier to measure degradation and the numbers vary a little bit, there's this general consensus that the area that's affected by the Amazon is huge. We're talking about more than twice the area that's annually deforested. And we actually know very little about this phenomenon at the moment. And so it's important to understand what's driving degradation. There's some preliminary evidence from my own research that degradation isn't just a first step in the process of completely cutting down vegetation in an area, right? We need to better understand what are the drivers behind this phenomenon, because in understanding the drivers and their dynamics, we can think about policies that can target this phenomenon and can be designed to combat degradation. So, and then the second part of moving beyond deforestation is that Brazil must monitor and protect its forest regrowth. So forest regrowth is basically just vegetation that grows back in areas that have already been deforested. And what we see from the official data is that about a quarter of the area that has been historically cleared already contains signs of forest regrowth. In many ways, that's good news because the forest can grow back, but it also points to really a wasteful pattern of land use, because we're still cutting down primary forests, we're losing all of those ecosystem services, and we're essentially abandoning those areas, which again speaks to the fact that a lot of this deforestation, it's not happening for productive purposes, right? But what this also points to is that there's huge potential for the restoration of degraded and deforested ecosystems in the Amazon. This can play a key role in contributing to the global effort of fighting climate change. It can improve the quality of life of local populations. It can contribute to enhance ecosystem services. Brazil, at the moment, just leaves this forest regrowth. It's entirely vulnerable. The reason for that is that our current monitoring systems, they weren't designed to detect secondary vegetation. They were only designed to detect the loss of primary forests. And so today, we don't have a system for tracking, for measuring forest regrowth, and we don't have a system for protecting this forest regrowth. We don't have an alert system for the loss of secondary vegetation. And we know that this can be easily, there are some technical challenges, but it is feasible to do this from a technological standpoint. Brazil has the technical capacity to do this, but this needs political support, right? And so I like to think about the fact that of addressing tropical deforestation is key, but it's only one part of this larger conservation puzzle that we really must solve for the Brazilian Amazon.
I think that reversal, that decline followed by the sharp increase in deforestation we're seeing really reminds us how we need a long-term solution, right? So it doesn't help to just slow down deforestation for a few years. We need really to help Brazil get on a more sustainable path over the long run. And so I think the lesson there is we need a good policy mix, right? We need positive as well as negative incentives, and we need a mix also in the sense that we need lots of different actors involved. So we know that national governments are politically fragile, right? So they can change from one point of view and one political perspective to another very quickly. If we have then multiple layers, we're not just depending on federal governments, but we also have state governments and local governments and the private sector responding to consumer demand, and then NGOs and civil society, all operating in what Eleanor Ostrom called a polycentric system, where they're backstopping each other, working together, but also providing a safety net. So if one layer that's working on finding a sustainable solution and reducing deforestation suddenly evaporates, which is sort of what's happened in Brazil with the federal government. Everything they were doing to reduce deforestation went away with the last election. You still have those other layers of governance there to continue the effort. So I'd take that lesson. I'd also take a lesson for us sitting here in the US, which is that local actors in the Amazon are looking to make a livelihood and increase their economic well-being. And that is perfectly rational. We'd expect them to do that. If we want them to act otherwise, we need to provide the incentives. We need to provide the benefits and the support, which recognize the huge value of conserving tropical forest to us. It saves biodiversity. It prevents carbon emissions. That's benefiting the globe. We need to somehow translate those incentives so that local people see them as well.
Thank you, Drs. Gandor, Mullen, and Sills. What we've learned is that recent estimates for 2021 suggest that deforestation rates are the highest they've been in the last 15 years. However, we've also learned that there are extraordinary successes that Brazil can build on. Research suggests that deforestation would have been 50 to 70% higher between 2004 and 2012 had the political economic power base in the southern Brazil not passed legislation to reduce deforestation. However, the reversal of these trends suggests that all levels of government, federal, state, and local, must act with the private sector and NGOs in what Eleanor Ostrom called a polycentric system if deforestation is to fall in the future. Engaging multiple levels of government with the private sector ensures that if one layer that's working on finding a sustainable solution or reducing deforestation suddenly evaporates, the entire system does not collapse. Finally, it's also important that behavioral approaches that engage local actors play a role. That is, it's important for the local people to see the benefits of conservation, both monetarily and ecologically, so that they have a forest to fight for, rather than a set of laws to fight against.